Good morning, everybody. Ruan Apton here for another behind the scenes. As all you know, I'm working on the audiobook for Robin Artisson's book on Carow Gwyn, Sorcery in the Ancient Fairy Faith. I'm doing it in this beaten down trailer that eventually is going to get pulled and taken down, and we're working on a fundraiser to replace it. Um, the shed kit I'm looking at is about $3,000. That's not counting any of the other supplies I'm going to need to put it together. But beautiful little shed that we've been looking at. Got windows and decent size. It'll definitely replace it very well. It'll make it things a lot safer for me, for my daughter. I'll be able to insulate it so I can keep my books and other witchy materials and stuff out here. That's giving us more room in the house. But so today we're going to be working on the first part of part 1 of the book. We already did the introduction last week. A few stops and goes and stuff, and because you don't want to rush anything like this, especially if you're working on an audiobook. You want perfection. Honestly, you want perfection in everything you do. Yeah, you're going to mess up, but you want to enjoy while you're doing it. And so sometimes when I record, I like to talk about, my thoughts about a passage that I may have read, and share it with, those who view the videos. And honestly, right now, we haven't had any viewers per se. If you have any questions, comments, stuff like that, that is what that area down below is for, is to leave your questions and comments. Oh, I also wanted to update you on my talks with Dr. John Grigsby. He's an archaeologist that's worked well with Robin, the Kilk, and Carow Gwyn. He wrote a couple books, Beowulf and Grendel, as well as Warriors of the Wasteland, where he takes his knowledge of archaeology and hands-on knowledge, because he gets out there. I'm in talks with him about making audiobooks for him. Now with his work, the problem is that he does have a publishing company, Watkins Publishing. He wants me to make the audio files, irrespective of any legalities. So I'm in talks with him on that right now. We haven't talked about if it's any payment or I offered just to do it just for doing its sake. So who knows? Maybe I'll get reimbursed, maybe I won't. Good books, though. Very important to have those books out there in various media to understand, because a lot of his theory actually confirms, and Carow Gwyn confirms a lot of other works by a lot of other people, and has inspired other people to write their stuff. Like John Grigsby, his work has influenced so many other fairy traditionalists, so many other authors in general. And so having that resource out there is kind of crucial, in my opinion. Kind of very crucial. But I just wanted to update you on what's going on with that. Like right now, he's in talks with his publishing company about the legalities of me doing audiobooks of his works. And it'd be pretty cool if it's accepted, and maybe some recognition that can get me into doing audiobooks as a voice actor or whatever that's called. I love reading aloud for the sake of reading aloud. Now, mind you, I do have throat issues and stuff, and so it's been a touch and go. And then let alone getting yourself in the zone and stuff. And so it's going to be touch and go with all my audiobooks. Partially because, like I said, I have to do it in this trailer, and there's a lot of pollen. I got horrible seasonal allergies. I've got throat issues, but that comes with being almost 42 years old. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and turn on the laptop. I try to do a recording of about an hour because of battery life. But yes, let's go ahead and get her open. Oh, come on. Usually I do the facial recognition to open my software. And now the thing is my headset is connected to the computer. It's got very strong noise canceling. And so you may hear the freeway, you may hear the train, but for the most part, on my audio files, you're not going to hear any of that. This headset by Razer is freaking amazing. And that's the other thing I am going to do when and if we can get that shed kit, is I'm going to be not just insulating it for the weather, but soundproofing it so that I can do this more often. Let's see. Let's go ahead and open up Audacity as soon as I close down these other behind-the-scenes programs, like that evil OneDrive. Go bye-bye. I hate Teams. I don't know why they even put it on here. Let's close up Dropbox. Yeah. I know I need to freaking restart my computer because of updates, but I don't want to. Open up Audacity. Yeah. I know I updated. Let's see. Let's open program. Open up and Carow Gwyn Draft 1. Let's have fun. Like I said, we're heading up the first part. Oh, come on. Like I said, we've already gotten that far in. It doesn't seem like much, but it really is. So let's begin. Part 1. The Ancient Fairy Faith and the Metaphysics of Fayerie. Fayerie. The word fairy is, as Captain Briggs says, late in origin. The older and more archaic term is fae, and is believed to be a degenerate form of the Latin fatum, referring to the power of fate, or of fatae, referring to the entities and far-reaching power of the supernatural fate women, or the spinners of fate themselves. Briggs notes that the classical 3 fates were multiplied later into many supernatural ladies who directed the destinies of human beings and attended childbirths. But on this point, an important note must be made. It was no later folkloric multiplication that changed the 3 fates into countless fates. The idea of nearly infinite numbers of Norns or fate-influencing spirits, always depicted as feminine, was a common belief throughout the ancient Germanic world. There can be no doubt that the Celtic language speaking world carried an organic equivalent to this Nornic model in the form of the ancient beliefs in fairy mothers, the genii cuculati, or the hooded spirits, and similar birth and abundance related spirit groups, and the motif of the fairy spinner ladies that appear nearly everywhere in folklore. Louis Spence observes the possibility that from fatum was derived a medieval form fatare, meaning to enchant. The past participle would have been fe, which later resolved itself into fee. He says this is productive of a noun Fayerie or Fayerie, signifying an enchantment or a state of illusion or glamour. This may have become adopted in the English to refer to both the location of fairyland and the spirits who dwelled within it. Briggs supports this by offering the form Fayerie to mean a glamour, and to refer to spirits or beings who wielded the perception-bending power of illusion. As a short study of its history shows, our word fairy is a strange word, interlaced with fateful connotations and the weirdness of enchantment. This makes it a very fitting term to refer to the uncanny and ambiguous inhabitants of the unseen world. Any being that's referred to as fairy is an inhabitant of the cosmological condition that can also be called fairy. The term refers to a being as well as a world or another continuum of interaction and intersubjective experience. Hey, why is it not recording my sound? Oh, screw me rotten. I forgot to turn. There's a sound button on my headset. There's a freaking sound button on my headset. See what I mean? Touch and go. Always issues. Let's go back. Gotta delete all that empty space. See what I mean? It's so fun doing audiobooks, isn't it? Absolutely wonderful. I didn't even pay attention to where I started time-wise. Like, I've got 30 some odd minutes recorded from last time. Okay, there we go. Let's go delete that. Okay. You know what I mean? It can be frustrating. But, like I said, I love reading. Here we go again. Deja vu, huh, guys? Testing, testing, testing. Come on. Okay, let's do the audio setup. Recording device. Headset. Okay, let's do a test. Okay, that's on there. Part 1. The Ancient Fairy Faith and the Metaphysics of Fairy. Fairy. The word fairy is, as Catherine Briggs says, late in origin. The older and more archaic term is fae, and is believed to be a degenerate form of the Latin fatum, referring to the power of fate, or a fatae, referring to the entities and far-reaching power of the supernatural fate women, or the spinners of fate themselves. Briggs notes that the classical three fates were multiplied later into many supernatural ladies who directed the destinies of human beings and attended childbirths. But on this point, an important note must be made. It was no later folkloric multiplication that changed the three fates into countless fates. The idea of nearly infinite numbers of Norns or fate-influencing spirits, always depicted as feminine, was a common belief throughout the ancient Germanic world. There can be no doubt that the Celtic language-speaking world carried an organic equivalent to this Nornic model in the form of the ancient beliefs in fairy mothers, the genii cuculati, or the hooded spirits, and similar birth and abundance-related spirit groups, and the motif of the fairy spinner ladies that appear nearly everywhere in folklore. Lewis Spence observes the possibility that from fatum was derived a medieval form fatare, meaning to enchant. The past participle would have been fe, as in F-A-E, which later resolved itself into fee. He says this is productive of a noun, Fayerie, or Fayerie, signifying an enchantment, or a state of illusion, or glamour. This may have become adopted into English to refer to both the location of fairyland and the spirits who dwelled within it. Brigg supports this by offering the form Fayerie to mean a glamour, and to refer to spirits or beings who wielded the perception-bending power of illusion. As a short study of its history shows, our word fairy is a strange word, interlaced with fateful connotations and the weirdness of enchantment. This makes it a very fitting term to refer to the uncanny and ambiguous inhabitants of the unseen world. Any being that's referred to as fairy is an inhabitant of the cosmological condition that can also be called fairy. The term refers to a being as well as a world or another continuum of interaction and intersubjective experience, which is just as real as our own human world and intimately enmeshed with it. To call an entity fairy is to say that they are part of a fateful dimension of forces that is connected to our ordinary world, albeit hidden from our ordinary senses, and somehow influential upon events that occur in our ordinary world. They influence or control human affairs, and do the same with natural phenomenon. As we have seen, it also suggests that they are enchanted, that they belong to a world of enchantment, or preternatural powers. Fairy, in this sense, is synonymous with the most archaic layer of the Greek term daemon, which once referred to spirits and uncanny, unseen, other than human powers that dwelled within an area or within or around human families and individuals. Over time, daemon came to take on new meanings. Daemons could be minor divinities, and later the word could be used to refer to the great gods and goddesses themselves. I got to go back and redo a few parts there. No, I got to go further back. Let's see. Well, yeah, further back. Okay, let's see. I think I messed up right there. Yeah, we'll start there. Start right there. Over time, daemon came in to take on new meanings. Daemons could be minor divinities, and later the word could be used to refer to the great gods and goddesses themselves. Daemons could be spirits of place, responsible for good or bad fortune, or mediator spirits between the gods and human beings. The personal daemon could be a guardian spirit for a man or a woman, following them through life, or it could refer to the aspect of the mortal being that was daemonic and thus immortal. Finally, and quite in keeping with what became of Fayerie, daemons became demons, malevolent spirits that the church forbade contact with. It was possible to speak of the demonic. See what I mean? Fun, huh? It was possible to speak of a demonic world to refer to the spirit world or the preternatural unseen dimension. Daemonism could be thought an ancient Greek form of animism. In precisely the same manner, we have seen fairy used to refer to the unseen world, and fairyism has been utilized by scholars of fairy folklore to refer to the older belief in fairies, which is clearly animistic in nature. The fairy faith and the ancient animistic cult of the dead. Fairy, daemon, and spirit are all synonyms. They all refer to other than human persons or entities, which primarily inhabit the unseen dimension of life and the world. The belief in such beings, the belief in their world and its intimate closeness to ours, is ancient and fundamental to humankind. The many activities humans have undertaken to relate positively with these beings, demonstrate respect to them, and, at times, protect themselves from them, carries us to the nigh universal core of animism and to what is called the fairy faith. As we shall see, fairy entities, as they are encountered in the pages of myth and folklore, come from many distinctive historical strands and origins. But there is a core origin for the reality of the fairy in Europe, a core reality that all other explanations or typologies for fairies orbit around and connect with. The fairy was originally encountered and venerated as the spirit of a dead person. The fairy faith is, from its foundation, a continuum of an extremely archaic European cult of the dead. This kind of veneration of the dead, the ancestral dead, or otherwise, is not specific to just one region or a handful of or regions in Europe. It is a Europe-wide and worldwide human cultural phenomenon which has taken many unique local forms. In Europe, the first fairy faith type practices were always local and land-centered, or chthonic. They were tied to the veneration of the dead who were merged with the landforms of the earth, or with nature and the spirit world. Between the ordinarily experienced human world and this merged or deeper world, there was an ongoing intercourse and communication. These two worlds were intercreative and interrelated. To die was to transform into the condition of fairy, and in some places, to be born was to be transformed from fairy into human. Birth and death are doorways between the seen and the unseen. To have the goodwill of the unseen beings, the faithful beings, is to see prosperity and blessings in this world of breathing life. Not all spirits or beings that could be encountered in the unseen world were the transformed souls of dead humans, but all dead humans were transformed into the fairy condition in one form or another. Not all the beings that came to be called fairies in much later folklore were the transformed souls of humans, but the transformed soul post-mortem existence motif is still the core of the ancient fairy belief. W.Y. Evans Wentz, in his book, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, gives an example of an animistic belief system from Australia, which demonstrates all the same principles I have discussed already. His example reveals the degree to which animistic systems from ancient wrong word, not ancient cultures, distant cultures. Here we go. Where was I? We'll start here with his example. Snip, snip, snip. And do it again. His example reveals the degree to which animistic systems from distant cultures can overlap and helps us to position the fairy faith more clearly within the animistic traditions of our world. And I quote, "To the Arunta tribes of Central Australia, furthest removed in space from the Celts, and hence least likely to have been influenced by them, let us go first in order to examine the doctrine of ancestral Alchiringa beings and of the Eruntarinia, which offers an almost complete parallel to the Celtic belief in fairies. These Alchiringa beings and Eruntarinia, to ignore the secondary differences between the two, are a spirit race inhabiting an invisible world. Only certain persons, medicine men and seers, can see them, and these describe them as thin and shadowy, and, like the Irish she, always youthful in appearance. Precisely like their Celtic counterparts in general, these Australian spirits are believed to haunt inanimate objects, such as stones or trees, or to frequent totem centers. As in Ireland, demons, hence daemons, are believed to frequent certain places known to have been anciently dedicated to the religious rites of the pre-Christian Celts, and quite after the manner of the Breton dead and most fairies, they are said to control human affairs and natural phenomena. All of the Arunta invariably regard themselves as incarnations or reincarnations of these ancestral spirit beings. And, in accordance with our evidence, ancient and modern Celts have likewise regarded themselves as incarnations or reincarnations of ancestors and of fairy beings. Also, the Arunta think of the Alchiringa beings exactly as Celts think of fairies, as real, invisible entities who must be propitiated if men wish to secure their goodwill, and as beneficent and protecting beings when not offended, who may attach themselves to individuals as guardian spirits." End quote. Wentz goes on to point out, quote, "In the New World, we find in the North American red men a race as much given as the Celts are to a belief in various spirits like fairies. They believe that there are spirits in lakes, in rivers, in waterfalls, in rocks and trees, in the earth and in the air, and that these beings produce storms, droughts, good and bad harvests, abundance and scarcity of game, disease, and the varying fortunes of men." End quote. In the Irish story, November Eve, the fairies are identified as the dead very clearly. Briggs gives this account of the story from her book, The Fairies in Tradition and Literature. Quote, a young man who had stayed out imprudently on Halloween was swept into a band of fairies going to a fair. He met Finvara, the fairy king, and Una, his queen. They gave him fairy gold and wine and were full of merriment. But for all that they were the company of the dead. When he looked steadily at any one of them, he found them to be a neighbor who had died, perhaps many years before. When he recognized them, they came around him, shrieking with laughter, and tried to force him into the dance. He resisted them until he fell senseless, and when he woke next morning, he was lying in a stone circle, and his arms were black and blue with the marks of fairy fingers. End quote. This short tale is super packed with core fairy-related motifs that we will explore deeper shortly. It demonstrates the motif of fairy raids or cyclical movement on certain seasons. It shows the fairy as spirit of the dead, the fairy dance, and the reality of violence in interactions between humans and fairies, leaving fairy marks, bruises, and injuries upon the flesh of a human being. The dark tale Kathleen, recounting the fairy encounters of Kathleen of Inisark, continues the fairy as dead motif. Kathleen's lover had died, and she was in the grip of deep mourning for him. One evening, when she was sitting by a roadside, a beautiful woman appeared to her and gave her a ring of herbs, some sort of wreath, and said she'd be able to see her lover if she looked through it. Upon looking through it, Kathleen saw her lover. He was very pale, but he was crowned with gold and dancing in a noble company. The woman then gave Kathleen a larger wreath and said she could visit her lover every night if she burnt a leaf from it, but that she can never pray nor cross herself while the smoke was rising, or he would vanish forever. After this, Kathleen became very withdrawn, obsessed with her visits to fairyland. Every night she burnt a leaf and lay in a trance, dancing in the bright hills of the fairy world with her lover, while the leaf was smoldering. Kathleen's family became very concerned, for she no longer attended church or confession, and she had become very changed from the person she had been. Kathleen's mother crept up one night to her bedroom, and while spying through the keyhole, saw Kathleen burn the leaf and lay in trance. She burst into the bedroom, praying and invoking the Mother of God to save her daughter and making the sign of the cross. At this, Kathleen started up out of her trance and shouted, "Mother, Mother, the dead are coming after me. They are here." And she began to have convulsions. The priest was called to pray over Kathleen. He cursed the wreath, which crumbled to ashes as he spoke. There was not much strength left in Kathleen, and right before midnight, she died. This folk tale doesn't just support the identity of the fairy people as the dead, but also brings to the forefront an ancient motif regarding the deep spiritual danger of longing too much for the dead. When the souls of people are bound together by powerful connections, love foremost among them, the death of one can lure the soul of the survivor into the world of the dead alongside it. This can cause the death of the person who survives in our world in a short time in some cases. This is one aspect of the folkloric and metaphysical notion of death contagion. John O'Conway, one of the informants of Evan Wentz, says of the fairies, whom he calls the gentry, quote, in olden times, the gentry were very numerous about forts, and here on the Greenlands, but rarely seen. They appeared to be the same as any living men. When people die, it was said the gentry took them, for they would afterward appear among the gentry, end quote. This folk-level understanding of the connection between the Fayerie people and the dead was clearly common across all segments of society. Emma Wilby quotes the philosopher Thomas Hobbes when he wrote, "The fairies are spirits and ghosts. Fairies and ghosts inhabit darkness, solitude, and grave." Wilby also mentions the Scottish theologian James Garden's statement regarding wizards or seers in his country, wherein he wrote, "The seers are people who converse with ghosts and spirits, or as they commonly call them, the fairies or fairy folk." One of the most important folk tales that has come down to us regarding deeper textures of the fairy as dead motif is the tale called The Fairy Dwelling on Selina Moor. This tale not only reaffirms, as countless other sources do, the core identity of many fairy people as the post-mortem beings of once breathing entities, but helps us to see just how aware pre-modern folk were of some surprising historical realities that layer themselves into the fairy tradition. Selina Moore reveals that among the fairy dead are the souls of Neolithic Europeans, still carrying on features of their prehistoric cultures while in the fairy realm. It also embraces and demonstrates many of the core fairy motifs, such as fairy abduction and the danger of fairy food. It is a story about a farmer named Mr. Noy who got lost in a treacherous bogland on the moor while trying to get home. He was found asleep in a ruined barn, and upon being aroused, had an alarming story to tell. Voice break. And so you see why it is so important for me to also work on the audiobooks for John Grigsby, because that's what he focuses on, the Neolithic, and elucidating what he understands of archaeology in his own studies, and what he presents to us in his books Beowulf and Grendel, as well as Warriors of the Wasteland, and gives us an idea of the pagan sacrificial nature in the Grail legends. In all these myths and folk tales, we have great lore that's been passed down to us. That is fairy traditionalism right there in a handbasket, is to reconnect ourselves with them unseen, with the good neighbors. And it is the essence of my work and what I do. But anyways, let's continue. He had tried to take a shortcut through the moor, but became lost. He wandered for miles over unfamiliar country until he came to a strange but beautiful orchard, which had a great house with music and hundreds of people dancing or sitting at tables and drinking. He believed he had found a house where people were celebrating harvest home and really wanted to rest and get a drink, so he approached the place. Upon drawing near, he noticed that the tables and the people were rather all small. There was a taller woman in white playing a tambourine, and she departed to the house to get a blackjack of ale for the new guest. She caught his eye and motioned for him to follow her, so he did. When he was alone with her, he recognized her as Grace Hutchins, a sweetheart of his who had died 3 or 4 years before. Grace thanked the stars that she had intercepted him before he had a chance to eat or drink anything. He wanted to kiss her, but she warned him about touching her or any of the plants or fruits here, if he wished to reach home again. She told him that had he eaten or drunk anything, he would have been changed into the small people state as she was. Grace revealed that she had eaten a plum in the fairy orchard there and became trapped in fairyland. Though her dead body was found on the moor and buried, She insisted that she was not dead, only taken, and that a sham body or a changeling corpse was left out to be found. The little people were calling and squeaking for Grace to bring more beer and cider. She was bound as a servant there. She explained to Mr. Noy that she was looking for sheep one night on the moor when she heard him calling for his dogs, and in trying to cut across the moor to reach him, had become lost. Dizzy, alone, and pixie-led, hearing music from near the orchard, she tried to eat a plum to soothe her feelings of hunger and thirst, but it turned to water in her mouth and she fainted. Upon awaking, she found herself surrounded by the fairy folk, who were thrilled at having a new woman to do chores for them, to bake and brew, and take care of their children who were no longer strong, as in the old days. Grace said that the fairy people there had little feeling, and what made them feel best were their memories of life as mortals. She says that these beings had lived thousands of years ago and were not Christian, but star worshippers. He said they preferred to live in smaller groups, not in larger groups together like Christian folk. Grace said that she was more accepting of her entrapment now that she had learned to shapeshift into a small bird and fly about near Mr. Noy. Noy, attempting to save Grace and himself, took out his gloves, turned them inside out, and cast them at the fairies. Immediately, all of them, including Grace, disappeared. He found himself standing in the ruin barn. Something then seemed to hit him on the head, and he dropped unconscious. After he returned home, it is said that Mr. Noy, like many other visitors to fairyland, lost all interest in life and became very withdrawn. The mention of star worship and the comment about the fairies in that dwelling being thousands of years old are clues to the Neolithic association I mentioned earlier. Ancient Neolithic monuments are very often clearly linked to the stars and celestial bodies, as all Neolithic societies seem to seek a vision of cosmic order in the movements of stars and such. I shall say more on the motif of fairy food and fairy abduction, which are so evident in this fine tale, soon. Historical sorcerers and witches often gained alliance or association with familiar spirits and helping spirits that were fairy people. Potentially, the most famous of these is the 16th century Scottish witch, Bessie Dunlop, who, in the midst of deep turmoil in her life, met with a ferryman named Tom Reed. Tom identified himself as a formerly living man who had died in the Battle of Pinkie 30 years before. He taught Bessie how to make ointments and heal livestock and other people, alongside predicting the death of her child. Their relationship was very intimate and instructive. Tom claimed that he had come to teach Bessie these things at the behest of the Queen of Elfhame, or the Queen of the Fairies, and that while she was pregnant with her child, a stout stranger lady who had come to her door seeking a drink, and was given one, was the Queen in disguise. The core reality of the fairy as post-mortem being for deceased humans or other breathing creatures in our world has been laid bare. When we bring to mind the intimate overlap and interchange that the fairy world or spirit world has with the ordinary world of experience, we must remember that fairy beings can just as easily and accurately be described as the prenatal beings of humankind or other breathing creatures. The fairy faith, in its most foremost aspect, can rightly be described as kind of soul ecology. Its first and perhaps foremost metaphysic is the belief in the soul, or an aspect of to humans and other breathing creatures that continues to exist in various phases of existence beyond this world after death. Wentz sums it up best. Quote, The fairy faith belongs to a doctrine of souls. That is to say, that fairyland is a state or condition, a realm or place very much like, if not the same as, that wherein civilized and uncivilized men alike place the souls of the dead, in company with other invisible beings such as gods, daemons, and all sorts of good and bad spirits. Seers say that fairyland actually exists as an invisible world within which the visible world is immersed, like an island in an unexplored ocean, and that it is peopled by more species of living beings than this world because it is incomparably more vast and varied in its possibilities. End quote. When we move away from this ancestral aspect to the archaic fairy cult, we run into the other major metaphysic tied to the fairy faith, which is the fruitfulness aspect. The fairy beings merged with the subtle interior of nature itself have some role in influencing its ability to yield food and abundance. Nowhere is this aspect of the fairy faith more clearly or beautifully described than in Catherine Briggs's excellent book, The Vanishing People, where she gives an account originally given to Miss Balfour from an informant in Lindsay. The local name used for the fairies where this man was from was the Strangers. He says of them, quote, "Folk thought the strangers helped the corn to ripen and all the green things to grow, and they painted the pretty colors of the flowers and the reds and browns of the fruits of autumn and yellowing leaves. And they thought that if they were offended, things would dwindle and wither and the harvest would fail, leaving people to go hungry. So they did all they could think of to please them and keep friendship with them. In the gardens, the first flowers and the first fruit and the first cabbage or whatnot will be taken to the nearest flat stone and laid there for the strangers. In the fields, the first ears of corn or the first potatoes were given to them. And at home, before people took their meals, a bit of bread and a drop of milk or beer was spilled on the fireplace to keep the green coaties, the strangers, from hunger and thirst." End quote. That this informant uses the local name green coaties for the fairies is instructive. The color green was always associated with fairy beings, and despite the modern life, growth, and health associations made with the color green, it may also have carried many death and spirit world related connotations to our ancestors. It can only make sense that fairy beings were associated with greenness, the ground that the dead are buried in, and the ground they merge with is green and made greener by their decay. Fairyland is likewise often depicted as inside the earth or below the ground. The fairy beings enliven the earth from inside it or from its interior depth. In the same account given above, the informant refuses to call the fairies by that name. He uses green coaties or strangers throughout. He warns Miss Balfour about using the term fairy. This is a very old aspect of fairy folklore that must be discussed. To call upon fateful powers is to attract their attention, ineluctably. Fairy became a shunned term mostly due to Christian culture in Britain and in other places. But it also carried, as we have seen, older connotations linking the fairy beings to the fates themselves. There was a sense of dread or caution for the weirdness and ambiguity displayed by spirit beings that pre-modern people wisely held. Thus, like the pagan peoples before them, pre-modern people utilized circumlocations for fairies that protected them from having to invoke them directly. Calling the fairies the good neighbors, or the people of peace, are two examples of human fear or caution-driven circumlocations that appear in the lore. In the same way that the pagan Greeks called the dreadful Furies the Eumenides, or the kindly ones, which both respected and flattered these powers without invoking them directly, and encouraged them to be benevolent towards humans. The old folk instinctively did the same for fairies. The informant's voice from Briggs gives a direct view into folk life that was deeply incorporated with the ancient fairy faith. His accounts of how humans practice giving to the fairies should be considered direct instructions to us now who wish to create and maintain friendship with the unseen world. And I'm going to stop recording there. It's almost been an hour. I've got a few other bumps and stuff in the audio I got to go back and fix, as anyone who has read the book or had the book on hand, where I've inserted my own words instead of what was written. And so I've got to go back, edit that, add in those proper words and terminology. But you see, this is why I think this book is so important. In the early 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, we had many of the neo-pagans at that time culturally appropriated indigeny from such cultures as the Native Americans, the Aboriginals of Australia. But the thing is, we have our own indigenous cultures. Those of us of Europe, Britain, and Eurasia, we have our own indigenous cultural teachings. We have our own fairy faith. And it's something we all can draw upon because it's our inheritance before the creation of such great, big, pantheonic, pagan cultures. This is pre-pantheon. This is true animism, in the sense of an animistic rebirth. Robin later goes on to kind of explain this phenomenon, that the fairy faith is like a rhizome, as he mentions in the book, that we'll get to at some point in these behind the scenes. Now, rhizome is basically a plant that can propagate itself from a small piece. It goes in the ground and comes out. It's not from like a separate seed. Like I believe it's the banyan tree there, or like there's a few natural forests that technically all are one big giant tree, the same root system, and that's exactly it. Carow Gwyn gives us a view at the root system of the fairy faith and how over time cultures have inserted their own rebirth of it, or changed some of the lore in praxis. In every couple hundred years or so, it's almost like there's a rebirth of the fairy faith. And Carow Gwyn is just one rhizome of an ancient tree. And there are other authors who also recount these things. Piper C.J., who's put out a few fictional stories, but has a degree in fairy folklore and traditions like that. We've got Morgan Daimler, who touches upon it, but has more of an Irish focus. But these traditions are available for all of us. In essence, in the end, going far enough back, we all inherited the fairy faith. And Robin later goes on to explain how we can practice the fairy faith without cultural appropriation. So much, in fact, that after reading and starting to do the practices in Carow Gwyn, I quit calling upon any specific names of divinities or deities. I wanted to get to the root of the spirit. I wanted to know the spirit intimately. And so I never called on names. I reached out and something reached back. One of those entities did eventually give me its name. And I still have a very reluctant relationship with this entity. One, because of cultural appropriation, unverified personal gnosis, but it's an entity that has been following me my entire life. And that would be the Morrigan. And now, I do work with the Morrigan based solely on my practice in Carow Gwyn. I've read some of the folklore in what's been recorded, but we got to remember, everything that has been recorded has been tampered with because of cultural biases. It's bound to happen. And that's fine, because it does happen. When you get to the essence of an entity and look behind the myths and stories and stuff that have been told of said entity that were encapsulated by a form of a priest or priestesshood, when a group of people, humans, build a cultic following, and I don't mean that in the negative pejorative term that we use nowadays for cult and stuff. I mean it in the sense of there is an establishment, an organization that gives due honor and reverence to certain entities. You lose a lot in the process, because no longer are you listening directly just to said entity. You are listening to the established precepts set up by those cultural influences. So if you want to get to the bare bones and get to know spirits, to learn to protect yourself, to learn to do what our ancestors did, or if you just want to be a good person, to be dutiful to the good neighbors, I highly recommend this book. And I am very blessed and grateful that I am the one working on the audiobook for it. And all these lessons and learnings and teachings we even get from the written myths go back to Neolithic times, changed, shaped, and adapted through the rhizome that is the perennial tradition. And so, thank you for being here. If you wish to help support my work financially, become a Patreon patron, which is where this link is posted from. And I have shared the last two behind the scenes, free of charge. You can go to my fundraiser for a new temple, request divinatory readings, offerings, and petitions to the good neighbors. All those donations and stuff go to either the supplies needed for such things or directly to the GoFundMe project to replace this building with a dedicated temple that is safe, secure, and where me and my coven can do the work that we do. And so with that, I want to wish you guys a wonderful Lunasa, Lamas. May you never hunger, may you never thirst, and may the good neighbors always be with you. So mote it be.